The colony was dead. Zane Callis had seen abandoned settlements before. War-ravaged outposts, mining stations stripped to their bones, forgotten research facilities swallowed by time. But this was different. There were no signs of a struggle, no bodies, no wreckage, just a hollow, rotting shell of what had once been a home to hundreds. He moved cautiously through the ruins, his steps muffled by the thick layer of dust coating the cracked pavement. The air was stale, carrying the scent of rust and decay, the kind that settled deep into forgotten places. Overgrown vines curled around skeletal metal structures, their tendrils creeping through shattered windows and broken doorways, reclaiming what had been left behind. Verin Prime. That was what this place had been called. Once a prosperous frontier colony, built on the promise of rich mineral veins beneath its surface. A hub for merchants, engineers, and families seeking a new life on the edge of explored space. Until suddenly it wasn't. No one spoke about what had happened here. Only whispers of a curse that had driven the settlers away. Superstition, mostly. Fear passed through supply routes and trader outposts, muttered over cheap drinks and half-lit comm screens. Zane hadn't given it much thought. At least not until he'd intercepted a distress signal, weak and fading, coming from this dead world. He should have ignored it. He didn't. Now, standing in the center of the ruined square, his pulse thrumming steadily in his ears, Zane knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. A whisper cut through the still air. "No one wants us." He turned sharply, rifle raised. For a moment he saw nothing but shifting shadows. Then she stepped forward. A woman emerging from the darkness like a ghost. She was tall, with a lean, almost ethereal build, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders in tangled waves. Her skin was deep blue, smooth and unblemished except for the black, swirling markings that twisted along her arms and neck like living ink. And her eyes, glowing silver, sharp and wary, pierced straight through him. She looked like something out of an old story, a forgotten deity carved into the ruins of a lost civilization. And yet she was very much alive. A small boy clung to her side, half hidden beneath the folds of her ragged cloak. He had the same blue skin, the same silver eyes. His tiny fingers curled into the fabric as he peeked at Zane with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Zane exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle just enough to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice even. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. "They all say that," she murmured. Her voice was low, worn, carrying an edge of exhaustion too deep for someone so young. Zane studied her, the way she positioned herself between him and the child, the tension in her muscles despite her obvious fatigue. She was ready to fight. She had probably been ready for a long time. "You sent the distress signal?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "And the rest of the colony?" Silence. "Then gone," she said simply. Zane frowned. He had questions. Too many, too fast. But pressing her wouldn't help. Not yet. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "What's your name?" A pause. She studied him, as if deciding whether he was worth the answer. "Cheyani," she finally said. Her voice was still guarded, but there was something beneath it, something cracking. Zane nodded, shifting his gaze to the boy. "And him?" Teoni's hand tightened around the child's shoulder. The boy didn't speak, but his silver eyes locked onto Zane's face, unblinking. He was small, but there was something unsettlingly still about him. Zane had seen a lot of kids in war zones, scared, desperate, clinging to whatever scraps of hope they could find. But Ren didn't look afraid. He looked expectant, as if he had been waiting for something, or someone. Zane's pulse kicked up slightly. He glanced at the markings curling across Teoni's arms, the way they pulsed faintly beneath the dim light. He'd heard stories of the marked ones before. People called them cursed, said that where they walked, ruin followed, that entire settlements had vanished because of them. He hadn't believed it. Now, standing here, watching the way the air felt heavier around her, the way the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of her form, he wasn't so sure. He didn't believe in curses. But he believed in fear, and if an entire colony had abandoned this place, leaving only her behind, something had scared them badly enough to run. Zane shifted slightly, fingers tightening around his weapon. He wasn't sure if it was a subconscious move toward self-defense or instinct kicking in. Tayani noticed. Her silver eyes flickered, and for the first time, something other than exhaustion passed through them. Resignation. "You see it now, don't you?" she murmured. "What I am." Zane held her gaze. "I see a woman who sent a distress call," he said evenly, "and a kid who needs food and warmth." Her jaw tensed. "And the markings?" "I don't know what they mean," he admitted. "Not yet." Her expression didn't change, but the way she exhaled, a slow, measured release of air, told him more than words ever could. She was used to people running. He hadn't. Not yet. A gust of wind stirred the dust between them, whistling through the hollow buildings like a distant echo of the past. Tayani lifted her chin. "If you stay, you'll regret it." Zane gave her a small, wry smile. "I regret a lot of things. This won't be one of them." For the first time, something almost like amusement flickered in her expression. Brief, gone too fast. But it was there. And as the night closed in around them, Zane knew one thing for certain. He had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. And it was far from over. Sunni deadened. The night was unnervingly still. Zane stood at the edge of the firelight, scanning the ruins beyond. The wind had died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of burning wood and the slow, steady breaths of Tayani and Ren, who sat on the other side of the fire. Zane had seen enough battlefields to know when something wasn't right. The quiet was too absolute. He sensed it too. She wasn't relaxed. Far from it. She sat stiffly, her hands resting protectively on Ren's shoulders, her silver eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched the darkness with the same sharp awareness he did. For hours they had spoken little. Zane had kept his questions to himself, and Tayani had offered no explanations. But she didn't have to. The ruins spoke for her. Baron Prime had been abandoned in a hurry. He had found overturned furniture, personal belongings scattered across dusty floors, doors left ajar as if their owners had fled in the middle of the night. There were no signs of a battle, no blood, no bodies. Just emptiness. And the only ones left behind were the so-called cursed widow and her child. Zane didn't believe in curses, but he had been a soldier long enough to believe in fear. And fear could drive people to do terrible things. A twig snapped in the distance. Tayani's entire body went rigid. Zane's pulse spiked, but he kept his expression neutral. He reached for his rifle, sliding it into his hands without a sound. Ren shifted closer to his mother, instinctively pressing against her side. Tayani wrapped an arm around him, but her gaze never wavered from the darkness. Zane spoke barely above a whisper. "How long have they been watching us?" Tayani didn't look at him. "Since sundown." His jaw tightened. She hadn't said a word about it. Either she didn't trust him yet, or she hadn't been sure he'd believe her. Another sound, a faint rustle, too controlled to be the wind. Zane moved slowly, rising to his feet. "They ever get this close before?" Tayani finally turned to him, her silver eyes flashing with something dark and unreadable. "They've never come this close and left witnesses." Zane's grip tightened around his rifle. There wasn't time for more questions. The shadows shifted, and then they attacked. Something huge erupted from the darkness, moving with unnatural speed, a flash of glistening black scales, a mouth full of serrated teeth. Tanny shoved Ren down just as the creature lunged. Zane fired. The plasma bolt tore through the night, striking the beast's side. It shrieked but didn't fall. Instead, it whipped around with terrifying speed and knocked him off his feet with a powerful tail strike. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the ground. Tiani was already moving. She drew a curved blade from beneath her cloak and launched herself at the creature, slashing at its exposed flank. The blade sank in deep, but the wound didn't bleed. Instead, the creature let out a horrifying, guttural laugh. Zane pushed himself up, dazed. That wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. Tiani snarled and ripped her dagger free, flipping backward just as the creature swiped at her. She landed lightly on her feet, her movements unnaturally fluid. The black markings on her arms were glowing. Zane barely had time to process it before the beast turned its attention back to him. It lunged. He barely dodged, rolling aside as its claws raked the ground where he had just been. He fired again, this time at its head. The shot landed. The creature howled in agony, staggering back. Tiani didn't waste a second. She sprang forward, moving so fast she was almost a blur, and drove her blade straight through its throat. The beast let out a final gurgling snarl before collapsing. Silence. Zane lay on his back, breathing hard, staring at the massive corpse. His pulse was still pounding in his ears, but his mind was catching up, putting the pieces together. The markings, the unnatural speed, the glowing skin. He turned his head to look at Tiani. She was standing over the creature, her blade dripping with something that looked like ink instead of blood. Her hands were trembling. Zane sat up slowly. "You want to tell me what the hell that was?" Tiani didn't answer right away. She wiped her blade clean, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to him, her voice eerily calm. "They sent it for me." Zane narrowed his eyes. "Who?" She hesitated. Then, softly, "The ones who cursed me." A shiver ran down Zane's spine, not from the cold, not from the pain in his ribs, but because for the first time since he'd arrived on this planet, he wasn't so sure curses weren't real. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional pop of burning embers and the distant howl of the wind through the ruins. The fire cast flickering shadows against the crumbling walls, stretching them long and distorted, as if the ghosts of the past still wandered through the remains of Varen Prime. Zane sat with his back against a rusted support beam, stretching out his aching limbs. His ribs throbbed where the Severn Hound had knocked him down, but the pain was distant now, pushed aside by something more pressing. Across from him, Tiani sat stiffly, her long black hair catching the firelight as she ran her fingers over the swirling black markings that curled along her arms. Ren lay beside her, wrapped in her cloak, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Zane watched her, but she didn't meet his gaze. She was lost in thought, staring at the fire with the quiet intensity of someone used to holding her pain in silence. Finally, he spoke. "That thing wasn't just some wild predator," he said, keeping his voice low. "It knew what it was doing." Tiani didn't respond at first. Then, slowly she nodded. "Yes." He waited, but she offered nothing more. Zane exhaled, stretching his neck, ignoring the tightness in his muscles. "You said they sent it for you. Who's they?" Tiani's eyes flickered. For a moment she looked almost hesitant. Not because she was unsure of the answer, but because saying it out loud meant acknowledging it was real. She exhaled softly, her fingers brushing absently over Ren's hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The ones who cursed me." Zane frowned. He had expected a name, maybe a faction, a rogue group, a corporation, but this was something else. She turned her arm slightly, letting the firelight illuminate the markings. "You've heard the stories," she said, her voice unreadable, "the legends about the marked ones." Zane studied the shifting, ink-like lines on her skin. He had heard the stories. Whispers passed between traders and mercenaries, drunken slurs muttered over dimly lit bar counters. People claimed that the marked ones were cursed, that entire settlements had been wiped out because of them, that those who harbored them invited ruin. He had never believed it. But now, sitting across from her, watching the way the markings seemed to breathe beneath her skin, he felt something deeply unsettling. "You're saying they're real?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Tayani let out a small, humorless laugh. "Would that make it easier to understand?" Zane didn't answer. She shifted slightly, staring at the fire, as if she could see something in the flames that he couldn't. "Varen Prime was supposed to be a safe haven," she murmured. "A place where people like me could live without fear. A fresh start." Zane frowned. "People like you?" She met his gaze then, silver eyes unblinking, unwavering. "The mark." Zane's fingers instinctively twitched toward his rifle before he caught himself. Tayani noticed, of course. She noticed everything. A shadow of something crossed her face, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she looked back at the fire. "It wasn't perfect. But for a time, we were free." Zane could hear the shift in her voice. A softness, a longing. He knew that feeling. The kind that only came from having something you never thought possible. Only to lose it. "What happened?" he asked. Tayani's jaw tightened. She was quiet for a long time. Then, her fingers traced a slow path along Ren's shoulder. "There was a sickness," she said finally. "At first it was small. 1 or 2 people falling ill. But then it spread. Fevers, convulsions, and then nothing. Just stillness." Zane felt a familiar weight settle in his gut. He had seen it before. The way people reacted when fear sank its claws into their bones. They searched for blame, for an easy answer, and when they found one, they held onto it like a lifeline. Deadly, they blamed the marked, he said quietly. Tayani nodded. "Of course they did. They always do." Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it now. Not just bitterness, not just anger. Something deeper. "They thought we had brought it here," she continued. "That our curse had poisoned the colony." Zane watched the way her hands curled into fists. "People I had known for years," she whispered. "People who had once called me a friend, who had trusted me to watch their children. They turned on us overnight." A heavy silence settled between them. Zane knew what came next. He didn't have to ask. "They may ran," he said. Tayani nodded, her expression unreadable. "The ones who survived fled. They took everything they could carry and left the rest to die." Not the sick, Zane realized. The marked. People like her. People like Ren. The fire crackled softly. For the first time since he had arrived on this planet, Zane wasn't sure if he was sitting across from a survivor or a ghost. His gaze flickered toward Ren. The boy's breathing was soft and even, but there was something different about him now. A small tension in his brow, the faintest twitch in his fingers. Zane's stomach twisted. How much does he know? Tayani sighed, brushing a gentle hand over Ren's head. "More than he should." Zane watched them for a moment before shifting his position, wincing as his ribs protested the movement. "And your husband?" he asked. Tayani stilled. For the first time, her eyes dropped to the ground. "I was afraid," she said quietly, "of the sickness, of me." She swallowed hard. "He tried to take Ren, to leave with the others. When I refused..." She trailed off, her hands tightening in the fabric of her cloak. Zane could see the rest of the story written in the tension of her shoulders. She had fought. She had won. But at what cost? She exhaled a slow, shaky breath. "I buried him outside the colony walls. Zane nodded slowly. He didn't say the words "I'm sorry." Not because he wasn't, but because he knew it wouldn't mean anything. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. And now? Tayani met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw it. The exhaustion, the years of running, the loneliness. "They won't stop," she said. "Not until Ren and I are dead." Zane felt something coil in his chest, a slow, simmering anger. He had come here expecting a simple rescue mission. Instead, he had walked into a hunt. His fingers brushed the grip of his rifle. "Oil," he said, voice steady. "Let's make sure that doesn't happen." Tayani blinked. For a moment he thought she might argue, but then, slowly, something in her expression softened. And she nodded. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, Zane had something worth fighting for. The storm raged on, hammering the metal ruins of Varen Prime with relentless sheets of rain. The wind howled through broken structures, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. Every flash of lightning illuminated the skeletal remains of the colony, casting long shadows that flickered like ghosts. Inside the crumbling remains of what had once been a supply outpost, Zane and Tayani sat close to a dimly lit portable heater, the fire they had built earlier long since extinguished by the relentless downpour. Ren was curled up on a makeshift bed of salvaged blankets, his small form rising and falling in steady breaths. He had slept through most of the storm, exhaustion finally claiming him after days of fear and running. Zane exhaled, leaning back against the cold metal wall, his gaze drifting to Tayani. She sat across from him, her long black hair still damp from the rain, strands clinging to her deep blue skin. The golden glow of the heater cast a soft light on her features, making her look almost ethereal, otherworldly in a way that had nothing to do with the fact that she wasn't human. Her silver eyes were distant, lost in thought, the fire reflecting off their metallic depths. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with perfection. She was a survivor, forged in fire, carrying a quiet strength that made Zane forget everything he had been taught about her kind. He had always known that beauty could be deadly. But this was different. She wasn't a danger to him. She was a danger to herself, too used to carrying everything alone, too accustomed to believing she had to. Zane shifted, rolling his shoulders as a dull ache throbbed in his ribs. "You ever seen a storm like this before?" Tayani blinked, pulled from her thoughts. She glanced toward the entrance, where rainwater dripped steadily from the jagged edges of the collapsed ceiling. "Once," she murmured. "A long time ago." Zane studied her for a moment. "Before Varen Prime?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Before everything." Her fingers traced absent patterns against her knee, her markings shifting faintly beneath her touch. Zane didn't press. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled something from his pocket. His fingers brushed against the delicate petals as he turned it over between his thumb and forefinger. A flower. Small and wild, its deep red petals looked almost black in the dim light. He had found it growing in the ruins earlier that day, a rare burst of life in a place consumed by death. Without thinking too much about it, he reached forward and held it out to her. Tayani frowned slightly, her silver eyes flicking to the flower, then back to him. "What is this?" Zane smirked. "It's called a gift." She stared at it, unmoving. Then, slowly, almost cautiously, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the flower from his grasp, her touch cool against his skin. She held it between her hands as if it were something impossibly fragile, something that might disintegrate if she wasn't careful. Zane expected her to say something, maybe a sarcastic remark or a comment about how impractical flowers were in a place like this. Instead, she just stared at it, longer than she should have. Then her breath hitched. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, barely audible sound. Zane's smirk faded. "Tayani?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the flower, as if testing its reality. She ran her thumb carefully over the petals, feeling their softness, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Then, softly, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "No one's ever given me one before." Zane's chest tightened. She wasn't looking at him. She was still staring at the flower, her silver eyes wide, almost childlike in their wonder, as if she didn't quite know what to do with it. Zane leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Seriously?" Théonie nodded, a small breathless laugh escaping her lips. "Seriously." She let out a shaky exhale, her shoulders rising and falling with the motion. "I've seen them before, in books, in markets when I was a child, but no one ever—" She trailed off, swallowing. Zane watched her carefully. He had given gifts before, trinkets, weapons, even favors, but he had never seen anyone react like this. She wasn't just surprised. She was overwhelmed. She looked down at the flower again, then, to his complete surprise, she smiled. Not a smirk, not a bitter, sarcastic expression. A real, genuine smile. Small, soft, incredibly rare. Something about it made Zane's breath catch. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, shaking her head slightly. Zane chuckled. "You don't have to say anything." She turned the flower over between her fingers again, still treating it like something precious. Then, after a moment, she lifted it to her face, inhaling deeply. Her eyes fluttered shut. For a moment she wasn't a warrior, she wasn't a fugitive, she wasn't the cursed widow, abandoned and hunted. She was just a woman holding a flower. Zane swallowed, suddenly feeling like he had intruded on something deeply personal. Then, without thinking, he reached out and brushed his knuckles against her cheek. Théonie's eyes snapped open. She didn't pull away. Zane's fingers lingered, tracing the damp strands of her hair, tucking them behind her ear. She tilted her face toward his touch, just slightly. The space between them shrank. His hand drifted lower, fingertips grazing her jaw, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. "Théonie," he murmured. Her name tasted different now, softer. She didn't answer. She just closed the distance between them. Her lips met his, hesitant at first. A whisper of contact, a question. Zane answered it without hesitation. He deepened the kiss, his other hand finding the curve of her waist, pulling her closer. She melted into him, her breath mixing with his, the warmth of her body pressing against his chest. The storm outside roared, but inside the world had gone quiet. Théonie's fingers curled into his jacket, holding on to him like she was afraid he might disappear. But Zane wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were still closed, her breath unsteady. Zane rested his forehead against hers, letting out a soft chuckle. "Guess that means you liked the flower." Théonie laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Idiot." But when she pulled back, she was still smiling, and in her hands she still held the red flower pressed gently against her heart. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world cloaked in mist and damp silence. The storm had washed away the dust and decay of Varen Prime, but it couldn't erase the truth. They were being hunted. Zane crouched near the ruins of an old transport hub, scanning the horizon through the scope of his rifle. The ground was slick beneath his boots, puddles reflecting the pale blue glow of the distant moon. The night was quiet. Too quiet. He could feel it in his gut. The storm hadn't just been a force of nature. It had masked something. Movement. Arrival. They weren't alone anymore. Behind him, Théonie was securing their gear, her motions precise and efficient. Ren stood close, half hidden beneath her cloak, his silver eyes darting between them, sensing the tension, even if he didn't fully understand it. Zane took a slow breath, adjusting his grip on the rifle. The weight of it felt heavier than usual. He had thought he was prepared for this. He had been wrong. A distant hum reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. Engines. Zane stiffened. He turned sharply toward Teani, his voice low but firm. "We have incoming." She didn't ask how he knew. She just nodded, pressing a hand to Ren's shoulder. "Go inside. Stay hidden." Ren hesitated for half a second before obeying, slipping into the shadows of the ruined building behind them. Zane slung his rifle over his shoulder, moving to Teani's side. "Who is it?" Teani's face was unreadable. "The ones who left and the ones they told." Zane exhaled sharply. "The colony survivors." The same people who had fled Varen Prime had returned, not to reclaim their lost home, but to finish what they had started. To kill the woman they feared. His grip on his rifle tightened. "So they brought backup?" Teani's silver eyes flashed in the dim light. "They always do." The ships landed with a hiss of hydraulics, sending ripples through the shallow puddles. Their hulls bore no insignia. Not official military, not corporate security. Bounty hunters. Mercenaries. Paid killers. Zane recognized the type immediately. He had worked with men like them before. No loyalty, no cause, just a price. A tall figure stepped forward from the group, a woman with short, silver-streaked hair and a scar cutting across her cheek. Her expression was hard, her stance relaxed but predatory. Zane had seen that look before, the look of someone who had already decided how this would end. "Teani," the woman called out, her voice steady, practiced. "It's time." Teani didn't move. Zane felt his pulse spike. "You know her?" Teani's jaw tightened. "Her name is Vela." "And?" "She was my friend." Zane cursed under his breath. Of course. The colony hadn't just abandoned her. They had come back with a traitor leading the charge. Vela took another step forward. "You should have died here," she said, her voice carrying through the empty ruins. "You and the boy." Zane moved slightly in front of Teani, his muscles coiled, ready. "You're making a mistake." Vela's gaze flicked to him. For the first time, she seemed to really see him. "You must be the new one," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Did she tell you what she is? What happens to the people who stand too close?" Zane's voice was like steel. "I don't believe in curses." Vela smiled, slow and knowing. "Then you haven't been here long enough." The moment stretched thin. Then, a single flick of Vela's fingers. Gunfire erupted. Zane barely had time to react before he tackled Teani behind cover, a hail of plasma bolts scorching the metal where they had stood. Teani was already moving, drawing her curved blade in a single fluid motion. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath steady, controlled. "You take the right," she murmured. "I'll handle the rest." Zane gave her a sharp look. "I don't like those odds." She almost smiled. "For them? They're terrible." Then she was gone, a blur of motion, her blade flashing in the moonlight. Zane cursed and swung around the cover, firing off 3 quick shots. One bounty hunter went down, the impact sending him sprawling into the mud. But more were coming. Too many. And then Teani's markings ignited. Zane had seen them glow before, had watched them shimmer beneath the firelight, but this was different. The air around her seemed to bend, warping as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. The mercenaries hesitated for just a second, long enough for her to strike. She moved like liquid shadow, her blades slicing through armor and flesh before they could even react. The markings on her arms pulsed, the dark ink spreading across her skin, alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Zane didn't know what he was seeing. He just knew he had never seen anything more deadly or beautiful in his life. The battle was chaos, gunfire, steel, the crackle of energy weapons. The air smelled of ozone and burning metal. Zane took down another bounty hunter, then turned just in time to see Vela advancing on Tiani. She had a gun raised. Tiani was still mid-Matmore, too far, too exposed. And for the first time, Zane didn't think. He moved. The shot rang out. Pain. Burning. Zane hit the ground, his vision blurring. Tiani screamed. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was her silver eyes flashing with something beyond rage, beyond fury, something ancient, something unstoppable. Then the world went black. Zane woke to warmth. Not fire, not the sun. Tiani was kneeling beside him, her hands pressed against his chest. A faint, unfamiliar glow flickered beneath her fingertips, her markings shifting, changing. Zane swallowed, his throat dry. Did we win? Tiani let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but her voice was thick with emotion. You're an idiot. Zane smirked. Yeah, but you like me anyway. She shook her head, exhaling slowly. I can't lose you too. His chest ached, not just from the wound, but from the way she looked at him. Soft, raw, unbreakable. He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. You won't, he whispered. Tiani closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against his. And for the first time in years, she believed it. The battlefield was silent. The echoes of gunfire had faded, leaving only the soft hiss of cooling metal and the distant crackle of a dying fire. The bodies of the mercenaries lay sprawled across the rain-soaked ground, steam rising from their armor. The storm had passed, but the sky above Varen Prime remained dark, clouds rolling over the ruined colony like a heavy shroud. Zane was barely conscious, his body slumped against a crumbling wall. Blood soaked his sides, staining the ground beneath him, but he wasn't looking at his wound. He was looking at her. Tiani stood in the center of the battlefield, motionless, her breath ragged. Her markings, the black, swirling patterns that had defined her existence, the ones she had been told carried a curse, were unraveling. At first it was subtle. The dark ink that had clung to her skin for years began to shift, the patterns loosening as if caught in an unseen current. Then, suddenly, they moved faster, lifting from her flesh in ribbons of shadow, curling through the air like smoke. Tiani gasped, clutching her chest. A searing heat spread through her veins, but it wasn't pain. It was release. Her entire body pulsed with an energy she had never felt before, something ancient, something buried deep within her. The markings weren't just leaving. They were breaking apart, dissipating into the air like ash caught in the wind. For the first time in her life, she felt light. She felt free. The truth of the curse. Zane forced himself to sit up, wincing as pain lanced through his side. He had seen a lot of strange things in his life. Alien technology, impossible creatures, things that defied reason. But this was something else. Tiani, he rasped, his throat raw. What's happening? She didn't answer immediately. She was too caught in the storm inside her. Then, memories that had never been hers flooded her mind. She saw flashes of a time long before Varen Prime, before she was born. A people, her ancestors, standing before something powerful, a ritual, a choice. The markings had never been a curse. They had been a seal, a prison not just for her but for the power within her bloodline, a power that, if left unchecked, could unravel the very fabric of reality. The ones who had come before her had locked it away, binding it to their own flesh. But seals don't last forever. Zane, his touch, his willingness to die for her. The moment he had bled in her arms, the moment she had reached for him with desperation so deep it burned, it had shattered the last chains holding it in place. She hadn't been cursed. She had been contained. Until now. The destruction of their enemies, A new force surged through her, something she had never felt before, a raw, limitless energy that had been waiting, growing stronger in the depths of her soul. And the mercenaries who still remained, those who had come to kill her? Vela, the traitor who had once called herself Tiani's friend, staggered backward, her eyes wide with horror. Her gun trembled in her grip, her confidence shattered. "What are you?" she breathed. Tiani turned toward her, her silver eyes burning like twin stars. She didn't answer. She lifted her hand, and the last remnants of the black markings flared one final time before exploding outward in a wave of sheer power. The air around her rippled, distorting as if reality itself had cracked open. A shockwave blasted through the battlefield, hitting the remaining mercenaries with the force of a collapsing star. Vela didn't even have time to scream. They disintegrated. One by one, every last enemy was erased, their bodies unraveling like dust in the wind. Their weapons, their armor, even their ships, were torn apart, as if the universe itself had rejected their existence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the power vanished. Tiani stumbled forward, her knees nearly buckling. The energy was gone, drained, as if it had never been there to begin with. She was whole, but she was no longer bound. She was finally, truly free. A life worth choosing. The silence that followed was deafening. Zane let out a slow, shaky breath. His body ached, his vision swam, but he was alive. And so was she. Tiani turned toward him, and for the first time since they had met, she looked like herself. No burden weighing on her shoulders, no chains binding her fate. Just her. She moved toward him, sinking to her knees at his side. Her hands trembled as they pressed against his chest, feeling for his heartbeat. It was strong. Relief flickered across her face, raw and real. "Not okay," she whispered. Zane smirked, despite the pain. You just erased an entire army." Tiani exhaled a shaky laugh, brushing damp hair from her face. "I know." Zane's gaze softened as he reached for her hand. "And you? How do you feel?" Tiani hesitated. She looked down at her bare arms, no longer marked, no longer tied to a past that wasn't hers. "I feel..." She swallowed. "Like I finally get to decide who I am." Zane squeezed her fingers gently. "Then what do you want?" She met his gaze, and there was no hesitation this time. The word was barely more than a whisper, but it carried more weight than anything she had ever said. Zane's breath caught. Then, slowly, he reached up and cupped her face. And this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't out of desperation, or adrenaline, or fear. It was because they had won. It was because they had a future. Because this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. A new dawn. By morning, they were gone. The old cargo ship Zane had hidden in the outskirts of Varen Prime was still intact, though it had seen better days. He had bought it cheap, patched it up himself. It wasn't much, but it could take them anywhere. Tiani stood at the edge of the loading ramp, her arms crossed as she gazed at the barren landscape one last time. She had spent years here, alone, hunted, abandoned. And now she was finally leaving. Zane stopped beside her, watching her expression carefully. "Second thoughts?" She let out a breath. "No." He waited. Then, quietly, she added, "I just never thought I'd get to leave." Zane nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "Well," he said, "turns out I'm good at breaking bad habits." Tiani huffed a small laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Zane grinned. "And you love that about me." She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but stopped. Because for once, she couldn't deny it. She just rolled her eyes, stepping up onto the ship. Zane followed, sealing the ramp behind them. Ren was already inside, curled up in one of the passenger seats. He wasn't asleep, but he looked peaceful. For the first time, he looked safe. Zane turned to Tayani. "Where to, Captain?" She exhaled, glancing at the endless expanse of sky stretching beyond the viewport. "Anywhere but here." Zane smirked. "Then let's get lost." The hum of the ship's engines filled the air, a steady rhythm that settled into the bones like a heartbeat. Zane leaned back in the pilot's seat, stretching his sore muscles as the vastness of space stretched before them. The shattered ruins of Varen Prime were long behind them now, nothing more than a speck swallowed by the endless black. For the first time in a long time, they weren't running. Beside him, Tayani sat in quiet contemplation, her silver eyes fixed on the stars. She looked different now, lighter, freer. Her bare arms, once bound by the swirling black markings, were now untouched, unshackled. The seal had broken, and yet she remained whole. Zane studied her in the dim glow of the console. "You thinking about what comes next?" Tayani let out a breath, a small, almost amused smile playing at her lips. "For the first time in my life, I don't know." Zane grinned. "Well, that's a start." She turned to look at him, really look at him. For so long she had believed her future was already written, that she was destined to be hunted, to be feared. Now, for the first time, she had a choice. And she wasn't alone. A soft rustling sound caught their attention. Ren stood at the doorway of the cockpit, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His small frame was silhouetted by the dim lights of the ship, and for a moment he just stood there, watching them. Zane gave him a lopsided smile. "Couldn't sleep, kid?" Ren shook his head, stepping forward hesitantly. "Where are we going?" Tayani exhaled softly. That was the question, wasn't it? She reached for him, pulling him into her lap, wrapping an arm around his small shoulders. He leaned into her without hesitation, resting his head against her chest. "Somewhere new," she murmured. "Somewhere safe." Ren looked up at her, his silver eyes flickering with quiet understanding. For the first time, he believed her. Zane watched them, something warm settling in his chest. He had never imagined himself here, with them, part of something bigger than just himself. And yet, he couldn't picture himself anywhere else. Tayani's fingers absently brushed over the red flower tucked into the folds of her cloak. The one Zane had given her. He caught the motion, smirking slightly. "You really are keeping that thing, huh?" She turned to him, arching a brow. "Of course." He chuckled. "Didn't peg you for sentimental." She tilted her head, considering. "Neither did I." She turned the flower over between her fingers, then, after a moment, reached forward, tucking it into his jacket. Zane blinked. "What's this?" "A reminder," she said. "Of what?" Tayani's gaze softened, her fingers lingering briefly over his chest, where his heart beat strong beneath the fabric. That you gave me something when I had nothing," she murmured. "And that I intend to return the favor." Zane swallowed, his usual wit failing him for once. He could only nod. He-ship's controls blinked softly, a new course set. One not determined by fear, but by choice. Tayani reached for the throttle, glancing at Zane. "Shall we?" He grinned, resting his hand over hers, their fingers intertwining over the worn metal controls. "Let's see what's out there." With a soft roar, the ship leapt forward, into the vast unknown. This time they weren't fleeing. They were going home.